How on earth did this tiny-looking country, just a speck on the map, manage to control a staggering 23% of the world's population? That's right. At one point, around 1/4 of all people on this planet were living under British rule. Imagine that. From the bustling streets of London to the far reaches of India, Africa, and the Caribbean, the British Empire was everywhere. But how did it happen? What drove this relentless expansion? And what were the consequences for those who lived under its shadow? In this video, we'll uncover the incredible story of how a small island nation became a global superpower, exploring key moments from its early beginnings in the 16th century to its eventual decline in the 20th century. Get ready to dive deep into the entire history of the British Empire. We unravel the triumphs and tragedies that shaped not just Britain, but the entire world. Hey there, friends! Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into the early beginnings of the British Empire, a time when England was just starting to spread its wings across the globe. So, grab your compass and let's set sail. It's the late 16th century, and England is feeling a bit overshadowed by its rival Spain. Spain had already claimed vast territories in the New World, and England was itching to get in on the action. But how do you compete with a giant? Well, it all started with a little thing called naval ambition. Enter Queen Elizabeth I, a true powerhouse. With her at the helm, England began investing heavily in its navy. She encouraged daring privateers like Sir Francis Drake to raid Spanish ships and ports. Imagine being a pirate with royal approval. These bold moves not only filled English coffers, but also sparked a fierce rivalry that would change the course of history. And then came 1588, a year that would go down in history. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. Picture this, a massive fleet of Spanish ships set out to invade England, but they were met by a smaller, more agile English fleet. Through clever tactics and a bit of luck, England emerged victorious. This victory wasn't just about defeating Spain. It marked the rise of England as a formidable naval power. With newfound confidence, England turned its eyes toward exploration and trade. In 1600, they established the East India Company, which would become one of the most powerful trading entities in history. But this company wasn't just about commerce. It was about carving out a piece of Asia for themselves. Spices, silk, and tea flowing into English markets. While trade was booming, England also had its sights set on colonization. The first attempts were rocky, but in 1607, Captain John Smith and his crew founded Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Can you imagine being one of those settlers? The excitement mixed with fear as you step onto this new land, filled with possibilities. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The settlers faced harsh conditions, food shortages, disease, and conflicts with indigenous peoples who were already living there. At first, there were some friendly exchanges, trading goods and sharing knowledge, but as more settlers arrived, seeking land and resources, tensions escalated quickly. By 1609, things took a turn for the worse as conflicts erupted with local tribes. And so, here we are, at the dawn of what would become an expansive empire, a story filled with both triumphs and trials, setting the stage for centuries of exploration, conquest, and conflict. Next, we continue our journey through history. Next stop, North America. Hey there, friends! Now we're heading to North America, where the British Empire began to take root in a big way. It's a story filled with ambition, struggle, and of course a bit of drama. So, let's dive right in. By the early 1600s, the British were establishing colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America. We've got Virginia, Maryland, and the New England colonies leading the charge. Each region had its own unique vibe. Think of them as different neighborhoods in a big city. Let's start with Virginia. Founded in 1607 at Jamestown, this colony was all about profit. The settlers were initially hoping to strike it rich with gold, but they quickly learned that tobacco was their golden ticket. As it turns out, tobacco became the cash crop that saved Jamestown from disaster. Imagine those early colonists working hard under the sun, planting row after row of tobacco. It wasn't easy. They faced starvation, disease, and conflicts with local Native American tribes, like the Powhatan Confederacy. But slowly, bit by bit, they found their footing. Now, let's hop over to Maryland. Established in 1634 as a haven for English Catholics seeking refuge from persecution back home, Lord Baltimore had a vision, a place where people could practice their faith freely. Pretty progressive for its time. But just like Virginia, Maryland soon found itself wrapped up in the lucrative tobacco trade. Meanwhile, up north in New England, things were a bit different. The settlers there were often motivated by religious freedom rather than profit. They built tight-knit communities, focused on their congregations and shared values. Town meetings became a hallmark of New England life. Imagine everyone gathering to discuss local issues over a cup of cider. In places like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, these meetings laid the groundwork for self-governance, a big deal that would come into play later on. The Puritans wanted to create a city upon a hill, a model society based on their religious beliefs. But as these colonies grew, both in population and ambition, tensions began to simmer between them and the British Crown. Fast forward to 1775, when those tensions boiled over into what we now know as the American War of Independence. It all started with protests against taxation without representation. Think about it. How would you feel if you were being taxed by a government thousands of miles away? The colonists felt betrayed and began to rally together for their rights. The conflict escalated quickly. Battles erupted at places like Lexington and Concord, igniting a full-blown war between the colonies and Britain. It was no longer just about taxes, it was about freedom. And then came 1783, when the dust finally settled after years of fighting. The Treaty of Paris recognized American independence, a monumental shift that meant Britain had lost its grip on its most prosperous colonies. But what did this loss mean for Britain? It wasn't just about losing land. It marked the beginning of a new era, one where former colonies would forge their own identities, separate from British rule. So stick around as we continue our journey through history. Next stop, the Caribbean. We're heading to the Caribbean, a place known for its stunning beaches and vibrant culture, but also a region deeply intertwined with the dark legacy of sugar plantations and the transatlantic slave trade. So, let's explore this fascinating yet heartbreaking chapter together. By the mid-17th century, the British set their sights on the Caribbean. In 1655, they seized Jamaica from the Spanish, marking the beginning of a sugar boom that would change the islands forever. But what made sugar so special? Well, it was often referred to as white gold, a cash crop that could make fortunes for those who cultivated it. Picture this: vast plantations stretching as far as the eye can see, filled with rows upon rows of sugar cane. The process of growing and harvesting sugar was labor-intensive and grueling. Enslaved Africans were brought in to work these plantations, as the indigenous populations had been decimated by disease and conflict. This is where things get really tough. The conditions on these plantations were brutal. Enslaved people worked from dawn until dusk, often facing violence and harsh punishments if they didn't meet their quotas. It's estimated that a third of enslaved Africans died within just 3 years of arriving in the Caribbean due to backbreaking labor and terrible living conditions. But amidst this suffering, there were moments of resilience. Enslaved people formed tight-knit communities, preserving their cultures and traditions despite the oppressive environment. They found ways to support one another through music, storytelling, and shared experiences. As sugar production soared, so did its importance in global trade. By the 18th century, Caribbean plantations were producing 80 to 90% of the sugar consumed in Western Europe. This created immense wealth for plantation owners back in Britain, but at an unimaginable cost. The demand for labor was insatiable, leading to the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and shipped across the ocean to work on these plantations. It's estimated that about 40% of all enslaved Africans ended up in the Caribbean, a staggering number that highlights just how crucial this region was for European economies. And let's not forget about the legal framework that supported this system. Like the slave codes established in places like Barbados in 1661. These laws dehumanized Africans, defining them as property rather than people. They laid the foundation for systemic racism that would last for centuries, but change was on the horizon. By the late 18th century, voices against slavery began to rise. Abolitionists fought tirelessly to end this brutal practice. Then, in 1807, Britain passed the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal to transport enslaved people within its empire. However, it wasn't until 1838 that emancipation finally came for many enslaved individuals in the British Caribbean, a bittersweet victory that marked a significant turning point, yet left deep scars on society. Next, we continue our journey through history. We're diving into a pivotal chapter in the story of India, the rise of the East India Company. This is where things get really interesting, so let's break it down together. First off, what exactly was the East India Company? Well, it all started back in 1600 when a group of English merchants received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I. This charter granted them a monopoly on trade in the East Indies. Basically, they were given the green light to explore and trade across Asia. Initially focused on spices and silk, they quickly realized that India had much more to offer. Now, why did they set up this company? Simple. The allure of profit was irresistible. The company aimed to tap into the rich resources of India. Think textiles, tea, and later, opium. They wanted to dominate trade routes and bring exotic goods back to England, where demand was skyrocketing. As the company expanded its operations, it established trading posts, or factories, along the coast of India. Places like Surat and Madras became crucial hubs for their trade activities. But these posts weren't just about commerce. They were strategic footholds that allowed the company to negotiate with local rulers and expand its influence. But here's where things take a dramatic turn. As competition with other European powers heated up, like the French and Dutch, the East India Company began evolving from a trading entity into a military power. Soon realized that to protect their interests, they needed more than just trade agreements. They needed control. And this brings us to a critical moment in history, the Battle of Plassey in 1757. So, let's unpack why this battle happened and why it's so significant. To understand the Battle of Plassey, we need to set the stage a bit. By the mid-18th century, the East India Company was no longer just a trading entity. It had become a powerful force in India. They had established trading posts and were asserting their economic dominance, which didn't sit well with local rulers like Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. Siraj-ud-Dowlah became Nawab in 1755, and he was determined to protect his territory from what he saw as British encroachment. The East India Company had been misusing trade privileges granted by him, which strained their relationship. Imagine being in Siraj's shoes, seeing foreign traders abusing their power while you're trying to maintain control over your own land. The situation escalated when the British fortified Calcutta without Siraj-ud-Dowlah's permission. This was seen as a direct challenge to his authority. To make matters worse, the company provided asylum to political fugitives, which further infuriated him. And then came the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident in June 1756. Where British prisoners were allegedly kept in a cramped dungeon. Many died due to suffocation and heat. This tragedy fueled anger against Siraj-ud-Dowlah and rallied support for a military response from the British. Enter Robert Clive, the British commander who saw an opportunity amidst this chaos. He formed alliances with discontented factions within Siraj's court, including Mir Jafar, who was promised the Nawabship in exchange for his support against Siraj. The battle itself took place at Plassey, on the banks of the Hooghly River. On that fateful day, Clive led about 3,000 troops against Siraj-ud-Dowlah's much larger army, around 50,000 soldiers. But here's where strategy came into play. Despite being outnumbered, Clive had secured key betrayals from within Siraj's ranks. When the battle began, Mir Jafar and others did not fully commit their forces to fight for Siraj, which severely weakened his position. After hours of fierce fighting, a heavy downpour hit the battlefield. The Nawab's troops were caught off guard. Without proper planning to protect their weapons from the rain, they were at a disadvantage. This unexpected twist turned the tide in favor of Clive's forces. In just 3 hours, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was defeated and fled, his reign crumbling before him. This victory didn't just give the East India Company control over Bengal. It marked a significant turning point in Indian history. Now, we're exploring a crucial turning point, the transition from East India Company rule to direct British governance after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. This was a time of upheaval and change, so let's dive in. First, let's talk about why this rebellion happened in the first place. By the mid-19th century, tensions were running high between the British and Indians. The East India Company had been expanding its control over India, implementing policies that angered many, especially local rulers and soldiers. One major trigger was the introduction of the Enfield rifle, which required soldiers to bite off the ends of greased cartridges made with animal fat, rumored to be from cows and pigs. For many sepoys, this was not just a matter of taste, it was a direct affront to their religious beliefs. This incident fueled existing grievances about discrimination and mistreatment within the military. The rebellion officially began on May 10, 1857, when sepoys in Meerut revolted against their British officers. This sparked a wave of uprisings across northern India, with rebels capturing key cities like Delhi and Kanpur. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II was even declared the Emperor of Hindustan by the rebels, a symbolic move that aimed to unite various factions against British rule. But it wasn't just a military conflict. It was a culmination of political, economic, and social grievances that had been simmering for years. Many Indians were fed up with heavy taxation, loss of land due to exploitative policies, and the erosion of their traditional rights. The British response was swift and brutal. They sent reinforcements and launched a campaign to suppress the uprising, leading to fierce battles that resulted in significant loss of life on both sides. By late 1858, most of the rebellion had been quelled, but not without leaving deep scars. As a direct consequence of this rebellion, the British government decided it was time for a change. In 1858, they dissolved the East India Company and transferred power directly to the Crown, marking the beginning of the British Raj in India. This shift meant that India would now be governed directly by British officials under the authority of a viceroy. While this brought about some administrative changes, it also meant that Indians had even less say in their governance. But let's not forget, this period also saw significant changes in infrastructure and society. The British introduced railways, which transformed transportation across India, making it easier to move goods and people. Education systems were revamped too. Western-style education began to spread, leading to new opportunities for many Indians, but also creating tensions as traditional practices were challenged. And then there were legal reforms. New laws were introduced that aimed at modernizing Indian society, but often clashed with local customs and traditions. While some welcomed these changes as progress, others viewed them as an attack on their way of life. So here we are at a crossroads in history. The transition from company rule to direct governance marked a new era for India filled with both challenges and opportunities. While some advancements were made, many Indians continued to feel marginalized under colonial rule. Stay tuned as we explore how these changes laid the groundwork for future movements towards independence. So stick around as we continue our journey through history. Next stop, Africa. Now, we're diving into a fascinating yet tumultuous period known as the Scramble for Africa, a time when European powers raced to claim vast territories on the African continent. So, let's unpack what happened during this era and why it was so significant. The Scramble for Africa kicked off in the late 19th century, primarily driven by European nations seeking new resources and markets. By the 1880s, industrialized countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium were hungry for raw materials to fuel their growing economies. But how did they go about this? Well, it all began with the Berlin Conference held from 1884 to 1885, organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. This conference was a pivotal moment where European powers came together, not to discuss African interests, but to carve up the continent among themselves. Can you believe that no African leaders were invited to this meeting? It was like deciding the fate of a neighborhood without asking its residents. The conference established rules for how territories could be claimed. The principle of effectivity was introduced, which meant that if a European nation wanted to claim land in Africa, they had to actively occupy and govern it. Otherwise, another nation could swoop in and take it. This led to a mad dash as countries scrambled to stake their claims. After the Berlin Conference, things heated up quickly. By the early 1900s, over 90% of Africa was under European control, a staggering transformation from just 10% before the conference. Key regions like Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria became focal points in this scramble. Let's start with Egypt. The British were particularly interested in controlling the Suez Canal, which was crucial for trade routes to India and beyond. In 1882, they invaded Egypt under the pretext of restoring order, but ended up establishing a protectorate that lasted for decades. Then there's South Africa, home to rich resources like gold and diamonds. The British clashed with both local tribes and Dutch settlers known as Afrikaners during the Boer Wars, leading to significant conflict and eventual British control over the region. In Kenya, British settlers established large farms, often displacing local communities in the process. The introduction of cash crops transformed local economies, but also led to tensions that would simmer for years. And let's not forget Nigeria. The British consolidated their power through military campaigns against various ethnic groups, claiming Nigeria by 1914 as a single colony despite its rich tapestry of cultures and languages. This rapid colonization brought profound changes across the continent, both culturally and economically. Traditional systems were disrupted, local governance structures were dismantled, and European powers imposed their own legal systems. But it wasn't all bad news. Railways were built, education systems were introduced, and infrastructure developed. However, these advancements often served colonial interests more than they benefited local populations. The consequences of colonization were far-reaching. Economically, African nations were forced into cash crop production for export. This limited their economic diversity and kept them dependent on European markets. Culturally, traditional ways of life were undermined as Western education systems took root. While literacy improved for some, it often came at the cost of erasing indigenous languages and traditions. The arbitrary borders drawn by Europeans disregarded ethnic boundaries, leading to conflicts that still resonate today. Many African nations struggled with internal strife rooted in these colonial legacies long after independence was achieved. So stick around as we continue our journey through history. Next stop, Asia. Friends, now we're diving into the fascinating world of colonial ventures in Asia, focusing on two key locations, Singapore and Hong Kong. These cities played pivotal roles in the British Empire's expansion, so let's explore how they became significant trading hubs and what that meant for the region. Let's start with Singapore. In 1824, the British officially took control of Singapore Island after an Anglo-Dutch treaty left it in their sphere of influence. This was a strategic move. Singapore's location made it the perfect gateway between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Imagine a vibrant trading hub where merchants from all over Asia gathered to exchange goods. The British quickly recognized its potential and established it as part of the Straits settlements, which included Penang and Malacca. By 1867, Singapore became a crown colony directly governed by Britain. The British turned Singapore into a major trade center, facilitating commerce not just for themselves but for other nations as well. It became known for its free trade policies, attracting businesses from around the globe. This influx of trade helped transform Singapore into a melting pot of cultures. Chinese, Malay, Indian, and many others contributed to its rich tapestry. Now let's sail over to Hong Kong. The British acquired Hong Kong Island in 1841 during the First Opium War against China. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 officially ceded Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. This was a significant moment. It marked the beginning of British colonial rule that would last over a century. The British were primarily interested in Hong Kong because of its strategic location and deep-water harbor, which made it an ideal base for trade with China. They quickly established it as a crown colony, which allowed them to expand their influence in East Asia. Hong Kong became a bustling trade hub, especially for opium, a commodity that fueled both economic growth and conflict during this period. The British were keen on maintaining their lucrative trade routes with China, which led to further tensions between the two nations. This brings us to the Opium Wars, fought primarily over trade disputes between Britain and China. The First War broke out in 1839, largely due to China's efforts to suppress the opium trade that was causing widespread addiction among its population. The outcome was disastrous for China. They were forced into signing unequal treaties that favored British interests, including ceding Hong Kong and opening several ports for foreign trade. This fundamentally altered China's relationship with Western powers. While these colonial ventures brought economic growth to places like Singapore and Hong Kong, they also had profound consequences for local populations. Traditional ways of life were disrupted, and local economies became heavily dependent on European markets. In both cities, colonial rule led to cultural exchanges but also cultural erasure. Indigenous practices often took a backseat to Western ideals. As infrastructure improved with railways and ports, it primarily served colonial interests rather than benefiting local communities. So stick around as we continue our journey through history. Next stop, the Pacific. Now, we're heading to the Pacific to explore the colonization of Australia and New Zealand. This is a story filled with adventure, hardship, and significant impacts on indigenous populations, so let's dive right in. Let's start with Australia. In 1788, the British established their first penal colony at Port Jackson, which is now part of Sydney. But how did this all come about? Well, after the American Revolution, Britain needed a new place to send its convicts. They were running out of space in their overcrowded prisons, and sending them to Australia seemed like a perfect solution. The First Fleet, consisting of 11 ships and about 1,500 people, including convicts, Marines, and officers, set sail from England in May 1787. They arrived at Botany Bay on January 20th, 1788. Captain Arthur Phillip led this expedition and quickly realized that Botany Bay wasn't suitable for settlement. settlement, so they moved to Sydney Cove, where they established what would become the colony of New South Wales. Life in those early days was tough. The settlers faced food shortages, unfamiliar terrain, and harsh weather conditions. Convicts were put to work building the settlement, planting crops, and establishing a community from scratch. But let's take a moment to talk about the impact on indigenous populations. Australia had been inhabited by Aboriginal peoples for over 60,000 years before the arrival of Europeans. These communities had rich cultures and deep connections to the land. When the British arrived, they claimed the land under the doctrine of terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one. This completely disregarded the rights and existence of indigenous peoples. As settlers expanded their territories, conflicts arose over land use and resources. The consequences were devastating for indigenous populations: displacement from traditional lands, introduction of diseases that decimated communities, and violent confrontations became common themes during colonization. Now let's hop over to New Zealand. The British interest in New Zealand grew in the early 19th century as European explorers began making contact with Maori tribes. In 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between British representatives and Maori chiefs. This treaty was intended to establish a legal framework for British settlement while recognizing Maori land rights. However, interpretations of the treaty varied widely between Maori and British authorities, leading to significant disputes over land ownership. As more settlers arrived in New Zealand, tensions escalated into conflicts known as the New Zealand Wars, which lasted throughout much of the 19th century. Just like in Australia, colonization had profound effects on indigenous communities. Disruption of their way of life, loss of land, and cultural erosion were rampant. So here we are, a complex legacy left by colonization that continues to shape both Australia and New Zealand today. While these countries have made strides toward reconciliation with indigenous peoples, there are still ongoing discussions about rights, recognition, and reparations. The stories we've explored remind us that history is never black and white. It's filled with shades of gray that affect real lives even today. Hey there, friends. Welcome back to our journey through history. In this part, we're diving into a significant chapter, the decline of the British Empire during the 20th century. This was a time marked by 2 world wars, economic strain, and a wave of independence movements that reshaped the globe. So, let's explore how it all unfolded. The British Empire was once the largest empire in history, but by the mid-20th century, it was facing unprecedented challenges. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, had already begun to expose cracks in the empire's foundation. While Britain emerged victorious, the war left it deeply in debt and weakened its global standing. After the war, there was a growing sense of nationalism among colonized nations. People began to realize they wanted self-determination and independence, ideas that were hard to ignore after fighting for freedom in Europe. This sentiment grew even stronger during the Second World War, which further strained Britain's resources. During World War II, Britain's colonies were not just passive. Many fought alongside British forces against the Axis powers. However, when the war ended, Britain found itself exhausted and financially drained. It became clear that maintaining an empire was no longer feasible. Now, let's talk about decolonization movements. The first major blow came with India's independence in 1947. After years of struggle, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, India finally broke free from British rule. This was a monumental moment that inspired other colonies to seek their own independence. But India wasn't alone. Across Africa and the Caribbean, people were rising up against colonial rule. Countries like Ghana gained independence in 1957, followed by a wave of nations throughout the 1960s and beyond. The empire was unraveling at an astonishing pace. In Africa, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya became symbols of this fight for freedom. The process wasn't always peaceful. Many nations faced violent struggles as they fought against colonial powers determined to hold on to their territories. The Caribbean also saw significant movements for independence, with countries like Jamaica gaining freedom from British rule in 1962. Each nation had its own unique journey, but they all shared a common goal: self-governance. The decline of the British Empire wasn't just about losing territories. It marked a profound shift in global power dynamics. Former colonies began to assert their identities and challenge the remnants of colonialism. While many former colonies joined the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent states, the legacy of colonial rule still lingers today, shaping politics, economies, and cultural identities across these nations. Welcome back to our journey through history. Now, it's time to talk about the legacy of the British Empire, a legacy that continues to shape cultural, political, and social landscapes in former colonies around the world. So, let's explore how this complex history still resonates today. The British Empire was vast, spanning continents and cultures. Its influence is still felt in many ways, one of the most obvious being the English language. It's one of the most widely spoken languages in the world today, serving as a common tongue in countries that were once part of the empire. Think about it. From India to Nigeria, English has become a bridge between diverse communities. But while it facilitates communication, it also raises questions about cultural identity and the loss of indigenous languages. Then there's the political impact. Many former colonies adopted systems of governance influenced by British models, like parliamentary democracy and legal frameworks. However, this has also led to challenges. In some places, political boundaries drawn during colonial times have resulted in ongoing conflicts and tensions. Take Kashmir, for example, a region with a complex history rooted in colonial decisions that continue to affect its people today. The legacy of British rule often left behind not just infrastructure, but also unresolved issues that nations are still grappling with. And speaking of infrastructure, let's talk about the physical remnants of colonialism. The British built roads, railways, schools, and hospitals across their colonies, often with the intention of serving their own economic interests. While these developments provided some benefits, they were primarily designed to extract resources and facilitate trade. Today, many countries still rely on this infrastructure. However, it often requires significant investment to adapt it for local needs rather than colonial purposes. The challenge lies in balancing these legacies with a desire for self-determination and cultural authenticity. Let's not forget the social impacts too. The British Empire often imposed Western values on local cultures, leading to tensions between traditional practices and modern influences. Indigenous populations in places like Australia and New Zealand continue to fight for recognition and rights over their lands and cultures. This ongoing struggle highlights how colonial legacies can create deep-seated divisions within societies, a reminder that history is never just about the past. It shapes our present and future. Now, let's talk about how the legacy of the British Empire has shaped modern geopolitics. The arbitrary borders drawn during colonial times have resulted in ongoing conflicts and tensions in regions like Africa and the Middle East. These divisions often ignored ethnic and cultural realities, leading to struggles that persist today. Moreover, the power dynamics established during the colonial era have influenced international relations even now. Former colonies have had to navigate their identities in a world where they often grapple with the remnants of imperialism. Economic dependency, political instability, and social challenges are just a few examples. But it's not all doom and gloom. Many nations have emerged from colonial shadows with renewed strength and resilience. They are redefining their identities on their own terms and asserting their place on the global stage. This transformation is a testament to the enduring spirit of those who fought for independence. As we reflect on this complex legacy, it's essential to recognize that history is not just about what happened. It's about understanding how those events continue to influence our lives today. The stories of struggle and triumph remind us that while we cannot change the past, we can learn from it to build a more equitable future. It's been a fascinating exploration of how an empire shaped our world, one that encourages us to think critically about our shared past as we move forward into the future. Wow, what a journey we've had exploring the entire history of the British Empire. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through time. And if you want to keep exploring incredible stories from the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, don't forget to share this video with your friends. You never know who might appreciate a little history in their day. Thanks for watching.